He took his fat cook-slave as a wife for a bet, and the whole county laughed. But behind the kitchen yard of a fading plantation, where grease fires burn before dawn and butchers' hooks sway in the heat, something else was cooking. A preacher's prayer reveals a mound of soft soil, ringed with lime and too warm to touch. Then come the buttons, the bones, and a ledger no one was meant to see, hidden behind the chimney bricks. What kind of meat was truly served under Perline's apron? If you would like me to continue creating stories so that this history, which is not taught in schools, is not forgotten, please subscribe to this channel. Write in the comments where you are watching from. The congregation of Mount Moriah Chapel shifted uncomfortably in their wooden pews, paper fans creating a flutter of artificial breeze in the April heat. Through the open windows, honeysuckle sweetness mingled with the heavy scent of rendered lard drifting up from Shady Glen's cookhouse below the hill. The smell seemed to follow Perline everywhere, even on her wedding day. Whitaker L. Prentice stood at the altar, tobacco-stained teeth visible in his perpetual smirk. His cotton suspenders strained against his belly as he rocked back on his heels, clearly enjoying the spectacle he'd created. Beside him, Perline's massive form remained motionless, draped in what everyone recognized as the yellow damask curtains that had hung in the plantation's formal parlor just yesterday. "Proceed, preacher," Prentice drawled, winking at the collection of landowners who'd gathered to witness his latest entertainment. "I won wagered this marriage fair and square, 3 hands of poker and a barrel of Augusta cider." Preacher Green's hands trembled slightly as he held his worn Bible. The leather-bound volume, wrapped carefully in protective cloth between services, seemed to weigh heavier than usual. His white beard twitched as he searched Perline's face for any sign of protest, but her large, emotionless eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond the chapel walls. "Marriage is a sacred covenant before God," Green began, his sonorous voice lacking its usual conviction. Several children giggled from the back pews, quickly shushed by their mothers. Dr. Orrin Westcott observed from his usual seat near the door, his physician's eye noting how Perline's shoulders slumped at an odd angle, how her breathing seemed shallow and irregular. His ink-stained fingers itched to record his observations in the leather journal he always carried. The ceremony proceeded with mechanical efficiency, Prentice's responses sharp and mocking, Perline's barely audible. Not once did she lift her gaze from the floorboards. The yellow fabric rustled with each small movement, the hastily sewn seams already straining in places. As the congregation filed out afterward, their whispered commentary grew bolder with each step away from the chapel. "Did you see how she just stood there, like a gotten ox? Well, what do you expect from Prentice? Man's not been right since his Catherine drowned. At least his cook's got a proper title now, though the Lord knows what for." Later that night, under a full moon that cast hard shadows across Shady Glen's grounds, Perline emerged from her kitchen. Her bare feet made no sound on the packed earth as she dragged a heavy cleaver across the yard. The blade caught the moonlight as she placed it deliberately on the chopping stump behind the smokehouse. A single bootprint marked the ash-dusted path nearby. Small, like a child's foot had pressed there recently. It pointed toward the smokehouse door. The next morning dawned bright and cool. Willard Sims, still drowsy and adjusting the borrowed straw hat that always fell in his eyes, headed out to fetch corn for the morning feed. His 2 big boots scuffed against the dirt as he made his way toward the storehouse, whistling off-key. He never reached his destination. Dawn crept over Shady Glen Plantation, the April sun barely strong enough to pierce the heavy mist rising from the cookhouse chimney. The smoke hung low and thick, carrying the familiar scent of bacon fat and wood smoke across the yard. From the direction of the corn crib came the sound of splintering wood and Whitaker Prentice's colourful cursing. "Damn barrel's gone to pieces." His voice carried across the morning stillness. "Where's that boy?" "Willard, get out here and clean this mess." Only the crows answered, their harsh calls echoing from the tree line. The stablemaster stuck his head out, cap in hand. "Ain't seen him since yesterday, sir. His cot's cold." By 9 o'clock, the spring sun had burned away the mist, revealing Willard's continued absence. The other workers exchanged glances as they went about their chores, careful to avoid Whitaker's increasingly sour mood. Someone sent word to town. Sheriff Elias Futch arrived just before 10, his grey coat already showing sweat marks despite the mild morning. He dismounted stiffly, favouring his old cavalry wound as he tied his horse to the hitching post. Whitaker met him at the front steps, tobacco juice staining the corner of his mouth. "Waste of your time, Sheriff. Boy's got the wandering fever, that's all. Probably halfway to Tarboro by now." Futch pulled out his logbook, licking the tip of his pencil. "Let's start with his sleeping quarters." The sheriff's inspection revealed Willard's few possessions undisturbed. A thin blanket folded military neat on his cot, well-worn boots tucked underneath, a small tin cup on the shelf above. No signs of hasty packing or struggle. "When exactly did anyone last see him?" Futch asked, making careful notes. "Yesterday evening. Sent him for corn." Whitaker waved vaguely toward the smokehouse. "Never brought it back. The lazy wretch." Futch methodically checked the outhouses first, then the smokehouse exterior. The heavy iron lock hung secure on the door. As he rounded the corner, a powerful odor made him pause. He noted in his book, strong scent of rendered grease and something bitter, medicinal. But the ground showed only normal traffic marks, nothing useful. Behind the kitchen, Perlin worked at her outdoor cooking area, massive arms steady as she stirred a pot of bubbling tallow. Steam rose around her like a shroud. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Ma'am, boy come by here yesterday." Perline's hands never stopped stirring. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the question. After an uncomfortable moment, Whitaker laughed from behind them. "Might as well ask the pot, Sheriff. She don't talk much since the wedding." As evening approached, Preacher Green made his weekly tithe collection rounds. The kitchen at Shady Glen was his last stop, warm yellow lamplight spilling from its windows. Inside, Perline ladled thick pork stew into a bowl, adding a wedge of fresh cornbread beside it. Green watched her hands tremble slightly as she set the bowl before him. His thick spectacles caught the lamplight as he studied her, noting how she kept to the shadows. Something dark stained her apron. Not the usual cooking grease or soot, but something black and tacky that seemed to catch the light oddly. "God's blessing on this food," he intoned softly. Perline's only response was to fade further into the kitchen's shadows. That Friday, the merchant's ledger at Henderson's General Store recorded a simple entry in precise handwriting. W.L. Prentice, 3 sacks lime, paid in full. Dr. Orrin Westcott looked up from his ledger as the bell above his shop door chimed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty window, illuminating rows of glass bottles and ceramic jars. Perline's massive form filled the doorway, her shadow stretching across the wooden floor like spilled ink. She moved with unsettling silence for someone her size, placing a folded paper on his counter without meeting his eyes. Her hands bore fresh burns, angry red welts across the palms. Westcott adjusted his spectacles and unfolded the note. The writing was Whitaker's distinctive scrawl. Required urgent. 3 sacks lime, 1 bottle valerian. Tincture, 2 portions laudanum. Strongest. Cash enclosed. The doctor's thin fingers traced the edge of the paper. "Second lime order this week," he murmured, more to himself than Perline. She remained motionless, hands folded over her stained apron. Westcott turned to his shelves, selecting bottles with methodical precision. As he worked, he pulled his client ledger closer, pretending to check prices while scanning recent entries. Yes, there it was. April 3rd. 3 sacks of lime, ordered through Henderson's store. Unusual quantity for household use. The valerian tincture came next, dark liquid sloshing in its green glass bottle. Then the laudanum, enough to sedate several men, or keep someone quiet. "Burns need treating?" he asked, gesturing to her hands. Perlin withdrew them into her sleeves. Still no word, no change in her blank expression. As he wrapped the bottles in paper, Westcott noted how she watched his movements with unnatural focus. The coins she placed on the counter were sticky with something that smelled of iron and smoke. Later that evening, after his rounds, Westcott took the long way home, past Shady Glen. The setting sun painted the plantation's white walls bloody red. He left his horse tied at the road and approached on foot, medical bag in hand as a pretense. The smokehouse loomed against the darkening sky, its heavy door secured with an iron padlock. Behind it, partially hidden by sprawling tobacco plants, he noticed a circular patch of disturbed earth. The ground there was tamped flat, ringed with a white powder he recognized as lye. Too neat for random digging, too fresh to be old work. Movement caught his eye. Perlin stood at the kitchen yard fence, still as a gravestone in the gathering dusk. She made no motion to acknowledge him, but her large, empty eyes reflected the last light like a cat's. The burns on her hands stood stark against the weathered wood she gripped. Westcott managed a polite nod and hurried away, his chronic cough suddenly worse in the thick evening air. Back in his study, by lamplight, he opened his private journal, bound in black leather, separate from his medical records. His hands shook slightly as he wrote. April 7th, 1854. Something unnatural in that kitchen. Cook's hands were burned, lime use unexplained. Consult preacher next. He blotted the ink and locked the journal away, unable to shake the memory of those eyes watching him from the shadows. In the morning, he would show his concerns to Preacher Green, who had agreed to investigate behind the smokehouse after Sunday services. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Shady Glen as Preacher Josiah Green and his brother Deacon Zebulon made their way up the dirt path, a covered pot of Sunday stew between them. Tobacco plants rustled in the warm breeze, their broad leaves concealing the brothers' true purpose from curious eyes. Whitaker Prentice sat on his front porch, shirt collar open, nursing a glass of amber liquid. He squinted at the approaching men, tobacco juice staining his chin. "Bringing the Lord's bounty," Preacher Green called out, holding up the pot. His thick spectacles caught the sunlight. "And hoped we might say a prayer over your garden, seeing as spring's upon us." Whitaker spat over the railing. "Waste of breath, but suit yourself. Kitchen's round back if you're looking for Perlin." The brothers made their way past the main house. The kitchen yard stretched before them, dominated by the looming smokehouse with its heavy iron padlock. Behind it lay the garden patch Dr. Westcott had mentioned, ringed with withering poke salad and lamb's quarters. "Check the soil there," Green whispered to his brother. "I'll keep watch." Zebulon, who'd spent 20 years digging graves before becoming deacon, knelt by the circular mound. His weathered hands worked, carefully, lifting away layers of earth while his brother pretended to inspect the tobacco plants. The soil was loose, recently turned. Beneath the surface layer, Zebulon's fingers brushed something coarse. He pulled free a clump of dark hair, scorched at the ends. Digging deeper, he found a pewter button, small enough for a child's shirt, and half of a wooden fork, its tines broken. Movement caught Green's eye. Perlin emerged from the kitchen, carrying empty wash baskets. She shuffled past them without looking up, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. The brothers exchanged glances, but kept their peace. "Ground's good for planting," Zebulon announced loudly, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. He slipped the found items into his coat pocket. Lord surely blessed this soil. That evening, after dark had settled over Edgecombe County, Zebulon rode to Sheriff Futch's house. The lawman listened gravely as the deacon laid out the scorched hair, button, and broken fork on his desk. "Rain's coming Wednesday," Futch said, examining the items under his lamp. Proper search would be easier once the ground's soft. Less obvious, too. He wrapped the evidence in a clean handkerchief and locked it in his desk drawer. "I'll ride out Thursday morning. First light." The predicted storm arrived Wednesday afternoon, bringing sheets of rain that turned the red clay to soup. Lightning split the sky over Shady Glen as water pooled in the yard, streaming down the slope behind the smokehouse. Near midnight, Mary Tate, passing in her wagon despite the weather, saw a sight that made her horses shy. Perline's massive form moved through the downpour, barefoot in the mud, dragging what looked like heavy burlap sacks toward the root cellar. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face, blank as a china plate, heedless of the rain. By dawn Thursday, the storm had passed. Sheriff Futch arrived early, as promised. The garden mound had collapsed inward, leaving a rain-washed hollow. Near the smokehouse wall, half buried in red mud, white fragments caught his eye. He knelt to examine them, pieces of bone scored with precise parallel marks. Cleaver marks. Sheriff Elias Futch's horse picked its way through the mud-slicked path to Shady Glen, hooves squelching in the red clay. Behind him, Deputy Marshal Thomas rode close, coils of rope hanging from his saddle horn. Dawn had barely broken, casting long shadows across the rain-soaked grounds. The air hung thick with moisture, and something else, a cloying sweetness that made Futch's mare snort and dance sideways. He dismounted at the kitchen yard, boots sinking ankle-deep in muck. "Rope it off," he ordered Thomas, pointing to the collapsed section behind the smokehouse. "Nobody in or out without my say-so." The deputy strung rope between fence posts, creating a rough square around the sunken earth. Futch knelt at the edge, ignoring the mud soaking through his trousers. With measured movements, he began scraping away layers of wet clay. His hand struck something solid. Bone-white fragments emerged from the red mud, some no bigger than his thumbnail, but one piece made his breath catch, a partial jawbone, small enough to fit in his palm, with 4 tiny molars still firmly rooted. "Get Dr. Westcott," Futch told Thomas. "Now." The physician arrived within the hour, his black bag clutched tight against the morning chill. Westcott's thin face grew even more pinched as he examined the remains, measuring them against his own hand. "Child," he confirmed, voice flat. "No more than 13 or 14 years, judging by dental development." He pointed to deep grooves scoring the bone. "These marks, clean cuts from a heavy blade, cleaver, most likely, made at time of death or very near to it." Futch stood, jaw clenched. "We need to search that root cellar." They found Whitaker on his porch, watching their movements with narrowed eyes. When Futch made his request, Prentice's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "This here's my property, Sheriff. Constitution says it's sacred as any church." He took a long pull from his tobacco pipe. "You want in that cellar, you better ride to Tarboro and get yourself a warrant. People are asking about that stable boy, Whitaker. And I told you, he run off. Ain't my fault if you can't keep track of your niggers." Prentice's grin showed tobacco-stained teeth. "Now get off my land, less you got paper saying otherwise." Futch's hands curled into fists, but the law was clear. Without a warrant, he couldn't force entry. He and Westcott left as the sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the death-touched earth. That night, a storm rolled in from the coast. Lightning split the sky as thunder shook the county's windows. By morning, Perline was gone. Visiting kin up Halifax way, Whitaker told concerned neighbours. Though everyone knew Perline had no family, her previous owner had sold them all decades ago. 2 days later, young Bobby Tate was cleaning the kitchen chimney when something heavy dropped onto the hearth. A leather-bound book, its pages stiff with soot, fell open to reveal careful columns of dates and initials. The last entry, dated April 12th, contained just 3 words. W.S. Rendered. April 14th, 1854. Mount Moriah Chapel basement smelled of damp stone and mouldering hymnals. 3 oil lamps cast wavering shadows as Preacher Green spread the soot-stained ledger across a pine table. Sheriff Futch and Dr. Westcott leaned in close, shoulders touching in the dim light. "Found it stuffed up the kitchen chimney," Futch explained, running a finger down the first page. "Writing's crude but clear enough." Westcott adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the childlike scrawl. 2 years of entries, each dated, each marked with initials. He pulled out his own notebook, comparing dates. "Look here, T.C. That's Thaddeus Crane. Disappeared last summer." "Family thought abolitionists took him," Green murmured, turning a page with trembling fingers. "Lord have mercy." "LP, that's Lucy Pollard," Futch said. "Went missing during the county fair. Parents swore she'd been stolen by gypsies." His voice hardened. "B.N. Billy Newport. His mama still puts flowers on the riverbank where they said he drowned." The ledger's methodical entries marched down each page like soldiers. Some had additional notes: tender, fought, quiet. Others simply read rendered, followed by blank spaces. Green stopped at an entry from 1850, his finger pressing hard against the yellowed paper. "C.P. Silent Meat," he read aloud. The words hung in the dank air like smoke. Futch's chair scraped stone as he stood. From his coat, he withdrew a leather folder of town records. "I checked the birth registry soon as we found this," he said, laying out a brittle page. "C.P. Catherine Prentice, Whitaker's own daughter." "The well drowning," Westcott breathed. "I remember writing the death certificate. Whitaker said she fell in while playing. Except there never was a well," Futch said. "Not on that property. Not anywhere near it. I rode every acre myself after she vanished." The 3 men stared at the ledger, its pages heavy with horrible truth. Outside, rain began to patter against the basement's small windows. "How many?" Green finally asked. "How many names in total?" Westcott had already counted. 23 entries, some repeated, not all complete. A knock echoed through the basement. Deputy Thomas stood in the doorway, holding a rain-spotted telegram. "Wire from Wilmington, Sheriff. Been delayed 2 days on account of the lightning strikes." Futch snatched the paper, water dripping from his sleeve, as he read aloud. "Large woman. Burn scars on hands. Boarded River Queen paddle steamer. Gave name Perry Lane. Recognized by Porter Miles Garth, former Prentice hand." "Stop." "Perry Lane," Westcott said. "Perline. She's barely trying to hide." Futch was already pulling on his coat. "Thomas, get the horses ready, and fetch Judge Harrison's warrant from my office." He carefully wrapped the ledger in oilcloth. "She won't get far. Not with this evidence." "Take care, Elias," Green called as the sheriff headed for the stairs. "Whatever drove her to this, whatever made her keep such careful count—" "Ain't natural," Futch finished. "None of it is. But it ends now." The basement door closed behind him, leaving Green and Westcott in lamplight, surrounded by shadows and the weight of names that would never answer roll call again. April 18th, 1854. The salt breeze from Cape Fear River mingled with wood smoke as Sheriff Futch and Deputy Hill approached the Magnolia House. Morning fog clung to the cobblestones, and a cart laden with oysters clattered past. The boarding house stood 3 stories tall, its white paint peeling like old bandages. Mrs. Dorothy Prescott, the landlady, met them at the door in a faded lavender dress. Her thin fingers worried at her collar as she spoke. "Room 7, gentlemen. Rear of the house." She lowered her voice. "Strange one, that Miss Lane. Paid in silver dollars, clean as Sunday plates. Hummed those spirituals all night, same tune over and over. Never did ask for sugar with her tea, neither. Ain't natural for a woman her size." Futch's boots creaked on the narrow stairs. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and salt pork. Outside room 7, he adjusted his gun belt, while Hill positioned himself by the window at the hall's end. 3 sharp knocks. "Miss Lane?" Sheriff's office. No response came, but they heard movement inside, the soft shuffle of bare feet on wooden floors. When Futch opened the door, Pearline sat in a straight-backed chair by the window, hands folded in her lap, staring at the harbor. She wore the same yellow curtain dress from her wedding, now grey with travel dust. Her breath came slow and steady, like a sleeping child's. The room held few possessions: a carpet bag, a tin cup, and, laid out carefully on the bed, a blood-stained butcher's apron. Beside it sat a mason jar filled with what appeared to be rendered fat, its surface clouded and pale. Around Pearline's neck hung a small iron key on a leather cord. "That's the cellar key from Shady Glen," Futch said, more to Hill than to Pearline. She didn't move, didn't blink. Futch pulled the ledger from his coat. The soot-stained cover caught the morning light. "Found your recipe book, Pearline." He opened it to the first page of names. "Want to tell me about these meals you've been preparing?" Her eyes dropped to her hands, but she remained silent. "Deputy," Futch ordered. "Secure the evidence." Hill gathered the apron and jar into an oilcloth sack, his face tight with disgust. They were fitting the manacles when a knock came at the door. A boy in a Western Union cap held out a brown paper parcel. "Mail for Miss Perry Lane," he announced, "from Charleston." Inside the package was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery, bearing the letterhead of the Caldwell family of Charleston. The letter praised the cooking and character of one Miss Perry Lane, recommending her for domestic service. Futch tucked the letter into his pocket. "We'll verify this with the Caldwells." He turned to Pearline. "Though I expect they'll be mighty surprised to hear their name used so." She rose without resistance, bare feet silent on the floorboards. As they led her down the stairs, Mrs. Prescott crossed herself and backed away from the landing. "Telegraph ahead to Tarboro," Futch told Hill as they reached the street. "Tell Judge Harrison we're bringing her in." Time to answer for those names in the ledger. Pearline walked between them, head bowed, still humming that same slow spiritual. The morning fog had lifted, leaving the air sharp and clear as a butcher's blade. Morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting prison bar shadows across the packed courtroom. The air hung heavy with spring heat and nervous whispers. Black attendees clustered near the back doors, while white townspeople filled the front benches, their Sunday clothes dampened with sweat. Judge Harrison Harrell adjusted his spectacles, the silver frames catching the light. Before him, Pearline sat in a straight-backed chair, wrists and ankles bound with iron. She wore a clean grey dress provided by the jail matron, her hands folded like fallen leaves in her lap. Whitaker L. Prentice occupied a seat behind the prosecution table, his collar wilting in the heat. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, affecting concern. "Shocked as anyone," he'd told the sheriff that morning. "Never knew what evil lurked in my own kitchen." Dr. Orrin Westcott took the stand first, his thin frame rigid with professional dignity. He opened his leather medical bag and removed a series of dated ledger pages. The defendant's hands show extensive chemical scarring, he testified, voice steady. Consistent with prolonged exposure to quicklime. My records show Mr. Prentice ordered 3 times the usual quantity for a farm that size. The burns suggest deliberate, repeated use. Sheriff Futch followed, placing tagged evidence on the clerk's table. Bone fragments in a cloth bag, the soot-stained meal ledger, the iron key from Wilmington. Found these remains behind the smokehouse, he reported. Child-sized, shows tool marks consistent with a butcher's cleaver. Preacher Green's testimony carried weight that silenced even the rustling fans. 7 children, he counted off on thick fingers. 7 souls from our county vanished over 2 years. Last seen near Shady Glen. We found that mound. His voice caught. Lord forgive me, I should have looked sooner. Miles Garth, the freedman porter from Wilmington, spoke quietly but firmly. Knew her right off, he said. That key she wore, same one from the old cellar. Couldn't mistake it, not after all them years working that place. Harriet Donnelly, the washerwoman, trembled as she recounted a whispered conversation by the creek. She was scrubbing sheets, Donnelly recalled. Told me some strange things about meat, said some don't scream after the throat's took. Thought she meant hogs at the time. Dear God, I thought she meant hogs. The defense attorney, court-appointed and sweating, argued that Pearline was simple-minded, easily led. He suggested stronger forces had guided her hand, though he never directly accused Whitaker. Prosecutor Samuel Whitfield rose slowly, letting silence fill the room. This woman, he declared, turned life into rendered fat. With calculation, with method. The ledger shows no passion, no madness, just inventory. Throughout the testimony, Pearline never raised her eyes. Her breathing remained steady, like someone lost in prayer or memory. Judge Harrell's gavel crack echoed like a gunshot. Having heard the evidence presented, this court finds the defendant guilty on 5 counts of murder. His voice hardened. Sentence to be carried out by public hanging on October 4th of this year. Ready, sir. Bailiffs led Pearline away. Timothy Wells, the court clerk, began organizing the evidence. His hand froze over the meal ledger. The binding showed clean cuts where 12 pages had been carefully removed, entries spanning from December 1848 to March 1850. Grey clouds pressed low over the courthouse square, threatening rain that refused to fall. The gallows stood stark against the colourless sky, fresh-cut pine still weeping sap onto the platform boards. A crowd gathered early, drawn by duty or darker curiosity, their boots crushing the frost-killed grass. Pearline emerged from the jailhouse at precisely 10 o'clock, flanked by deputies. Prison rations had carved away her bulk, leaving a different woman, gaunt, almost translucent. Her grey dress hung loose, rustling with each measured step. The sound of hymn singing rose from her lips, barely above a whisper. Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Sheriff Futch stood at attention, beside the platform steps, his expression carved from granite. He'd aged years in the month since finding those first bones. His logbook lay open on a nearby table, waiting for its final entry. From his position near the gallows, Preacher Green gripped his worn Bible with whitened knuckles. His eyes kept drifting to the last row of onlookers where Whitaker Prentice lingered, tobacco juice staining his chin. The former master wore traveling clothes, his horse already saddled at the hitching post. The executioner, brought in from Raleigh, tested the rope one last time. Hemp creaked against the crossbeam. Pearline mounted the steps without assistance, her bare feet silent on the wood. The hymn never faltered. let the water and the blood from thy wounded side which flowed. Dr. Westcott watched from his office window across the square, pen hovering over his final report. He'd examined her that morning, noting, subject displays unusual calm. No signs of distress or remorse. The drum roll began, a hollow sound like distant thunder. Perline's song rose above it, steady to the end. The trapdoor dropped with a brutal crack. By sunset, Whitaker Prentice had vanished. His horse was found tied outside Taylor's general store, where he'd left papers selling Shady Glen Plantation for a fraction of its worth. The clerk reported him boarding the southbound coach, carrying only a small leather satchel. 3 days later, Preacher Green led a small procession behind Mount Moriah Chapel. 9 pine boxes, some barely larger than bread crates, were lowered into consecrated ground. No names marked the shared plot, only smooth river stones laid in a circle. In his office that evening, Sheriff Foch made his final entry for the year 1854. Lantern light pooled across the open page as his pen scratched out the words. Burnt the apron, buried the ledger. Ain't found those missing pages. If Prentice had a hand in it, it's with God now. He closed the book with a dull thud, like earth falling on a coffin lid.